The Second Son of Wyndcliff, a Regency tale of betrayal, exile, and redemption. Chapter 1. Shadows at Wyndcliff. The winds of Wyndcliff never truly slept. They prowled the hills like restless spirits, hissing through the eaves and sighing among the chimneys of the old house that bore their name. On some nights they howled with such ferocity that even the stoutest door shuddered in its frame. On others they murmured low, like voices remembering the past. It was said among the villagers that Wyndcliff House could feel its own decay. What had once been a proud estate of wealth and consequence now wore the shabby air of a gentleman fallen on hard times. Roof tiles slipped, garden paths grew wild. The great clock in the west tower had stopped, its hands forever frozen at 6:10. Inside, the Earl of Wyndcliff, grey and gout-stricken, brooded before his fire. His breath wheezed faintly with each exhalation. His fingers, once quick and commanding, now trembled as they rested upon the carved lion heads of his chair. Opposite him stood his two sons. Sebastian Alton, the elder, already styled Lord Alton, was the image of aristocratic pride. Tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed even amid the damp gloom of Hampshire, he exuded confidence like scent. The faintest curl of amusement tugged at his lips whenever he looked upon his younger brother. Christopher, by contrast, was quieter in countenance and speech. His dark hair fell untidily over his brow, and his eyes, steady, intelligent, and unsettlingly direct, betrayed thought rather than arrogance. The younger son of an impoverished title had learned early to measure his words and conceal his worth. For days the household had been uneasy. Letters had arrived, tempers had flared. Servants whispered that the Earl had discovered something, a scandal involving Christopher, whispered the maids. Money, said the grooms. A woman, insisted the cook's boy with relish. Now, in the dim library thick with the scent of pipe smoke and old ledgers, the reckoning had come. The Earl's hand struck the table with a force that startled even himself. "You have disgraced me, sir," he barked hoarsely. "Debts, deceit, dishonour. You have dragged the name of Alton through filth." Christopher flinched. "Father, I beg you, on what evidence do you speak?" "This!" The old man thrust a letter toward him, crumpled and blotted. "A merchant in Portsmouth writes that his daughter, a decent girl, has been ruined by your promises, and that you owe him 200 guineas lost at cards in his own house. I will not have it." Sebastian stood slightly behind their father's chair, eyes lowered, the very picture of filial restraint. Yet Christopher saw the shadow of satisfaction flicker across his brother's face. "I swear to you," Christopher said, voice shaking but firm, "I have never set foot in that man's house, nor met his daughter, nor played at his table. The letter is false." "False!" roared the Earl. "Do you accuse me of blindness or the world of conspiracy?" "No, sir," Christopher said softly, "only of being deceived." Sebastian interjected smoothly. "Perhaps, father, it is not for us to judge too harshly. My brother is well-intentioned perhaps, but naive. The world is cruel to innocence." The words, so gently spoken, struck harder than accusation. Christopher turned toward him. "You would speak for me, brother, when you have longed for my downfall." Now, said Sebastian, lifting a hand as though soothing a child. "Do not mistake concern for envy. I would see our family united if only you would cease providing cause for scandal." Their father groaned, pressing a hand to his brow. "Enough, I will hear no more. Christopher, you will quit this house within the day. You shall have a small allowance, sufficient to find employment abroad. I will not endure another week of shame." "Father, please, leave me!" The order came like thunder. Christopher hesitated only a moment, then bowed stiffly. "As you wish, my lord." He turned to go. As he passed his brother, their eyes met, one pair bright with triumph, the other dark with disbelief. In that moment, a truth rooted itself deep in Christopher's heart. He was betrayed. He left the library, the corridor, the echoing hall with its portraits of stern ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow him in pity. At the great door he paused. Rain slanted across the courtyard, blurring the stables and the distant fields. A single trunk awaited him, packed hastily by the one servant still loyal, an old groom named Harris. "God bless ye, Master Chris," the man murmured, eyes wet. "You'll find better fortunes than this place can give." Christopher pressed a few coins into the man's hand and stepped into the rain. The carriage that bore him away rumbled down the long, rutted drive beneath oaks stripped bare by wind. He looked back only once, at the grey outline of the house on the hill, its windows gleaming faintly like dying embers. A gust swept the rain sideways, and Wyndcliff vanished into mist. He reached London after 3 days, mud-splattered, hollow-eyed, his name already tarnished among the few acquaintances he possessed. Letters of recommendation had been sent ahead by his father, to an uncle he barely remembered, Mr. Edward Alton, long engaged in trade with the East India Company. The letter was curt, unsigned, save for the trembling scrawl of the Earl's secretary. "This youth is my second son. He is to have no further claim upon me. I commend him to your discretion." Thus ended one life and began another. London was a furnace of noise, wheels clattering, hawkers crying, chimneys smoking. Christopher, bred among the quiet fields of Hampshire, felt himself half blinded by its chaos. Yet beneath the din he sensed possibility. He sold his watch, his cufflinks, even his father's old signet ring to afford passage to India. On the night before he sailed, he wrote one letter to his brother. "Sebastian, I leave England because you wished it. May you find peace in what remains of our father's house. I ask only that you care for our tenants better than he did, and that, one day, you remember me not as a rival, but as a brother wronged. Christopher." He sealed it without bitterness, for he knew that the world had a way of righting itself in time. Whether Sebastian read the letter or laughed at it, he did not care. At dawn the next day, the ship Caledonia weighed anchor upon the grey Thames, bound eastward. As England's coast receded into the fog, Christopher stood at the rail, watching gulls circle above the wake. The gulls turned, the sea darkened, and the horizon swallowed home. Chapter 2. Calcutta and the Making of a Man. The voyage eastward lasted 5 months. 5 months of roaring seas, mildew-damp cabins, and an endless horizon that blurred day into night. To many passengers it was exile. To Christopher Alton, it became transformation. Each wave seemed to strip away another layer of the man he had been, the soft-voiced younger son of a forgotten family, and forge instead a creature of endurance. When at last the Caledonia dropped anchor on the wide brown river of the Hooghly, dawn lay over Calcutta like a sheet of burnished gold. Palms bowed in the humid breeze. The air smelled of salt, jasmine and tar. Beyond the quays the city shimmered, a jumble of white stucco mansions and bamboo huts, of English officers on horseback and barefoot porters balancing baskets upon their heads. Christopher disembarked into heat that stole his breath. His coat clung instantly to his back. Sweat ran into his eyes. But his pulse quickened with something that felt like hope. Mr. Edward Alton, his uncle's counting house, stood near the Custom House quay, its facade plain but spotless. The sign above the door read, E. Alton and Company, importers of textiles, indigo, and tea. Edward Alton was a man of 50, lean and sun-darkened, his grey hair cropped close as a soldier's. He greeted his nephew with a brisk handshake and a level stare. "So," he said, "you're Richard's boy, the one they say has a head for figures. I hope so, sir, Christopher answered. I wish to earn my bread honestly. Good. We do not live on pride here. Pride sweats and counts ledgers like the rest of us. Then softening, you'll lodge above the office till you find your footing. India is no place for idle sons. Thus began Christopher's apprenticeship, not in books or fencing halls, but among bales of silk, casks of indigo, and men who spoke 10 tongues of trade. The learning. At dawn he rose to the cry of hawkers and the clang of temple bells. He learned the rhythm of the docks, the rumble of bullock carts, the hiss of ropes through pulleys, the shouts of lascars hauling crates. His hands blistered from work, his skin burned, yet he persisted. Under his uncle's tutelage, he mastered invoices, manifests, and the delicate arithmetic of exchange rates between rupees, pounds, and pagodas. He learned when to trust a broker, and when to smile while declining his price. He learned that honesty, in a land rich with deceit, was rarer, and therefore more valuable than gold. At night he studied Hindustani by lamplight. The servants laughed kindly at his accent, until he could bargain with them fluently for rice or sugar. In time they called him Sahib Alton the Just. Your father sent you here as punishment, Edward said one evening as they dined on curry and rice upon the veranda. Do you mean to stay punished? No, sir, Christopher replied, eye steady. I mean to build. His uncle chuckled. Then you may yet outstrip us all. Trial by fire. The following year brought monsoon and plague. The river swelled until it swallowed half the lower quarter. Fever carried off clerks by the dozen. When Edward Alton himself fell ill, Christopher took command of the office. He rode daily through rain that drenched him to the bone, overseeing shipments, paying wages, and sending medicines to the workers' huts. By the time the skies cleared, the firm still stood solvent while competitors had collapsed. The act earned him not only respect, but partnership. On his 28th birthday, his uncle set before him a parchment bearing the new seal. E&C Alton and Company. You have earned your share, Edward said quietly. Do not squander it in the gaming houses of Calcutta, as many young Englishmen do. Christopher smiled. Once I was accused of gambling. I doubt I shall ever tempt fate with cards again. Years rolled on. Ships bearing the firm's mark came and went between Madras, Canton, and London. Christopher diversified into cotton ginning, shipping insurance, even small banks that advanced credit to honest craftsmen. He paid fair wages, treated his Indian clerks with dignity, and in return they gave him loyalty fierce as kinship. At dusk he would ride beyond the city to where mango trees shadowed the river. There, watching the sun sink blood-red into the water, he would think of Hampshire, of the cool grey hills and the house he had left behind. At times bitterness whispered, "They cast you out." Yet another voice answered, "And made you free." Letters from home were few. One bore the news that the old Earl had died and Sebastian had succeeded to the title. Another, years later, told of Sebastian's marriage to a Devon heiress. After that, silence. No word of gratitude, no mention of reconciliation. Still, the name of Alton began to travel homeward in other ways. Merchants in London spoke of an Englishman in Calcutta whose integrity was legend. His ships arrived on time, his goods were never adulterated, his bills always honoured. When he sent remittances through the Bank of England, clerks noted the sums with disbelief. By 40, Christopher Alton was wealthy beyond imagination and alone. It was on an evening thick with jasmine scent that a letter arrived, its paper frayed from many hands. The handwriting was spidery, the seal cheap. Sir, the Earl of Wyndcliff is dead these 6 weeks. The estate lies much encumbered. His lordship Sebastian lives, though the house is near ruin. If you are indeed his brother, perhaps you should know, A friend. He read it twice, then folded it slowly. Outside, thunder rolled above the river. His uncle, older now, rheumy-eyed, watched him from across the veranda. "Bad news, boy?" "Old news," Christopher murmured, "only that ghosts still haunt Wyndcliff." Edward poured him brandy. "You have built a world here. Why look back?" Christopher gazed into the dark where lightning flickered. "Because some debts are not written in ledgers." He rose, his decision already made. "I must return." Edward Alton nodded slowly. "Then go as a man, not as a beggar. Take what you have earned. Let England see that trade is no disgrace." Christopher clasped his uncle's frail hand. "Everything I know I learned from you." "Then prove it," Edward said, smiling faintly. "Rebuild what pride destroyed." Chapter 2. When the Viceroy of Bengal set sail for London, a tall Englishman stood at her rail watching the coastline fade. The river mouth widened, the palms shrank to specks, and the humid wind gave way to the salt-cold breath of the open sea. In his cabin below deck were 3 chests, one of letters and ledgers, one of spices and silks meant as gifts, and one, iron-bound, filled with the fortune of a lifetime. He travelled not as exile now, but as merchant prince. As the last light of India sank beneath the horizon, Christopher whispered a quiet farewell. "You made me, Calcutta. Now let me make amends." The Thames received him with a cold kiss and the sour breath of coal. London, seen first as a smudge of smoke and steeples against a leaden sky, resolved into clamour, cries of lightermen, the creak of derricks, the splash of oars and the bark of river pilots. Christopher stood a moment at the gangway of the Viceroy of Bengal and let the noise wash over him like a benediction. No longer a youth with a trunk and a stain upon his name, he came ashore a man made and tempered elsewhere. He wore a dark, well-cut coat that did not strive to be fashionable, ashburn cloth that drank the light, clean linen, boots burnished by salt air. He had shaved on the swell of the Channel and taken bread and coffee at dawn, a sailor's breakfast to steady a merchant's thoughts. In his right hand he carried a scuffed leather folio. At his back, 2 iron-bound chests travelled under the watch of burly lascars who had followed him from Calcutta to Portsmouth and from Portsmouth to London without once losing sight of the cargo, or the man. At the foot of the gangplank, a boy with a cap too large for his head peered up. "Porter, sir?" "I know a carman as'll not cheat ye more in another." Christopher smiled. "Honesty is a rare recommendation, my lad. What is your name?" "Tom. Sometimes Tom of Billingsgate, if I'm sent to fetch." "Very good, Tom of Billingsgate." 2 chests for Carey and Bligh Bankers, Lombard Street, and 1 to my lodgings off the Strand. Can you find such places? Tom's face lit with pride. "Aye, sir." "Then you shall have a shilling for finding them, and another if nothing is lost." Tom grinned and whistled to a carman. Within minutes, the iron chests were crane-lifted to a dray and secured. The lascars, smiling at the boy's patter, accepted Christopher's clasped hands and soft words of thanks in Hindustani before melting back into the press. He turned his face inland. Fog mingled with chimney smoke and the acrid tang of tanning yards. London had grown in his absence, as all unruly things do, more people, more noise, more appetite. Yet beneath the city's appetite he sensed the old pulse of trade, the great artery that ran from river to counting house and back again. He followed it. Lombard Street, old money, new man. The goldsmith bankers of Lombard Street wore discretion like a second skin. At Carey and Bligh, the clerk who took one look at Christopher's credentials, letters from Madras bankers, schedules of bills drawn on East India House, acknowledgements of remittances in 5 figures, rose half out of his chair. "Sir, Lord, Mr. Alton? The man stammered, tripping over status like an unpracticed footman. Your letters precede you. Mr. Bligh would be delighted. Mr. Alton will do, Christopher said mildly, setting the folio upon the polished desk. I should like to place certain sums under discreet management. They are to be divided across consols, mortgages of unimpeachable security, and such short paper as you would trust with your own children's bread. Mr. Bligh materialized, bowing and effusive, a sleek gentleman whose silence had earned him fortunes, and friends who never spoke his name aloud. The iron chest was carried into a back room where counters were cleared and scales set out. Though Christopher's face remained impassive, the counting stirred something old and raw within him. Not avarice, but proof. Each gold sovereign that clinked upon the scale whispered the same quiet phrase. You were not broken. They concluded with handshakes that were firm and brief. May we congratulate you, sir, said Bligh, on a reputation of unblemished honour. Better to congratulate me, Christopher answered, on an uncle who taught me to keep my word. And your future plans in England, Mr. Alton? To visit Hampshire. He let the word fall without elaboration, and the banker's courteous face did not crease. Men in Lombard Street did not ask what they were not paid to know. Southward, by stages, to Wyndcliff, he took rooms at a modest inn near the Strand for a night, and left with the dawn, preferring the jolting honesty of the stagecoach to the upholstered whispers of a private post-chaise. The coach rattled through Surrey's wet lanes and Kentish hedges, past chalk pits and sheep-studded downs, before turning westward into Hampshire where the earth darkened and the distances widened into fields that his boyhood feet had known by every furrow. Rain marched in ragged files across the sky, the wind throwing shreds of cloud like torn sail. By evening, the coach set him down at a market town 7 miles from Wyndcliff. He walked the last mile alone. Neglect speaks a language of its own. He read it in broken hedges, in the bramble that choked once-ordered copses, in ditches clogged and rank with weed. A gate hung by one hinge, scarring the post at each gust. The cottages nearest the road bore thatch patched with tarred canvas and windows stuffed with rags. A child with thin wrists and a laugh too ready ran after him and stopped when he turned, because gentlemen did not usually turn when children called. "Sir," the boy said, darting nearer, "are ye the new bailiff?" "The old one drinks," Christopher crouched. "Do I look like a bailiff?" The boy considered. "No, you look like a proper sort." He swallowed the ache the words raised. "What is your name?" "Ben. My dad says we'll go to Portsmouth if the rent don't ease. There's no work and no seed." "Don't go yet, Ben," he said. "Give Wyndcliff a little time." The boy shrugged the way hungry boys do, half bravado and half shiver, then flashed away like a bird. He reached the lodge gates at twilight, the stone pillars still reared up, pitted with weather, their ironwork scrolls rusted, but proud. The lodge itself had shuttered windows and a door swollen by damp. No smoke rose from its chimney. Beyond, the drive unspooled under oaks that had not felt a pruning knife in 20 years. At the end of the ghostly aisle stood the house, Wyndcliff. It was both less and more than memory, less grand, more wounded. A slate from the east wing's roof had slipped and taken 3 others with it. Water had painted slow brown tongues down the stone. Ivy had choked 2 chimneys and sent green fingers under the cornice. But the long facade still looked upon the valley with that expression Wyndcliff had always worn, the one Christopher's tutor had called imperium, a gaze that expected obedience from wind and man alike. He stood a while at the edge of the gravel and let the winds of his boyhood pass through him. "Who goes there?" A voice cut across the dusk, suspicious and high. A footman in livery, rubbed thin by too many brushings, too many years, emerged with a stable lantern. Its glow made a small trembling circle upon the gravel, bright as a coin upon a pauper's palm. "I am Christopher Alton," he said quietly. "I have come to pay my respects to the Earl." The lantern lowered a fraction. "Lord Sebastian is at home." The word Lord struck like a fingernail on glass. Christopher nodded. "Announce me." The footman looked him up and down, taking in the good wool, the clean boots, the face that resembled another's if one had long memory, and swallowed. "If you please, sir." He was shown, after a wait designed to wound, into the drawing-room. It had been refurnished since his youth with a taste that mistook glitter for grandeur. French mirrors foxed at the edges, gilded chairs whose silks had faded to the colour of old limes, a carpet whose pattern writhed like snakes. Cards lay scattered upon a marquetry table, 2 decanters sweated on a silver tray. Sebastian stood at the hearth, handsome still in the way of men whom corruption will one day ravage but has not yet undone. He turned lazily, and for an instant surprise broke the practised languor of his face. Then he smiled. "Well," he said, as if greeting a cat who had learned a new trick, "the second son returns." "Come to seek forgiveness, or merely an allowance?" Christopher bowed. "Neither. I came to offer condolences on our father's death." "Ah, filial piety, how touching in a man absent 20 years. Sebastian tipped a measure of brandy and held it up to the light. "You might have come sooner." "I was at sea when the news reached me," Christopher said, and felt in the words the cold, flattening weight of all that was not said. "I was building a life you tried to extinguish." Sebastian gestured to a chair as if to grant clemency. "Sit, if you like." He did not wait for Christopher to sit before continuing. "I had thought you dead somewhere beyond Suez, or, if alive, tattered and begging. Yet you appear tidy." "It is not difficult to be tidy," Christopher said evenly, "if a man keeps his accounts." The faintest twitch crossed Sebastian's mouth. "What accounts could you possess?" "You always had a nose for the dull. Books, figures, ledgers. I warned father it would come to this." "This?" Christopher repeated. "A return," Sebastian said, "with claims. Brother, I am not ungenerous. The estate is strained beyond anything you can imagine. Father's sins, and a few of my own. But I will not see you starve. A small allowance may be contrived, provided you are discreet." "Discreet about what?" Sebastian sipped. "About the condition of things. Tenants are gossips, servants worse. If it were known beyond Hampshire that Wyndcliff is, let us call it, liquidating what can be liquidated, certain vultures might descend too greedily." "Unentailed lands," Christopher said. "Timber, perhaps." "Leases to be sold, rights mortgaged twice and thrice until the parchment is more ink than skin." The Earl's eyes flashed. "Do not presume to lecture me upon the management of my house." "I do not," Christopher replied softly. "I only speak the language neglect has written upon the hedgerows." There was a small silence. The wind hooted down the chimney, riffling the scattered cards. "Have you a wife?" Sebastian asked suddenly. "No." "Good. Dependents complicate requests for charity." He set down the glass and came nearer, as if to inspect a curiosity. Up close his pupils were the size of pinheads. "I warn you, Christopher, I will not have whispering here. Stay a week or stay none at all as you please, but do not meddle. You have your India. I have Wyndcliff." Christopher rose. Some part of him, boyish still, wanted to fling a dozen truths into that handsome, ruined face. Another part, tempered by heat and long accounts, chose a different currency. "I thank you for your frankness," he said. "I shall take rooms in the village." "You have coin for rooms?" Sebastian's smile widened, almost kindly. "Very well. Send me your direction. If I can spare £50 a quarter, that will be unnecessary. Pride is a poor diet. So is brandy, Christopher said, and bowed. Good evening, my lord. For a heartbeat, Sebastian stared at him, as if at a reflection that had misbehaved. Then he laughed, a pleasing sound hollow of sense, and rang for the footman. He took a small brick house at the edge of the market town, a place with a tiled floor, a clean hearth, and a view over gardens that had not yet given up. The widow who let it eyed him with a mixture of suspicion and relief that he paid a month in advance, and asked nothing more than privacy and hot water. The next morning he sent 3 notes. The first went to Mr. Abel Dyer, an elderly attorney whose stiff back and stubborn ethics had survived 3 earls. The second to Mr. Evan Harrow, once a promising land steward now reduced to drafting beer for a tavern he lacked the temperance to keep. The third, written with particular care, to Lady Anne Alton, Countess of Wyndcliff. He expected only 1 reply. He received 3. Mr. Dyer arrived at noon, smelling faintly of starch and old vellum. He removed his hat, examined the modest room, and nodded as if a figure had balanced. I had hoped, Mr. Christopher, that one day the better of the 2 brothers would sit across my table again, he said without preface. Lord Sebastian has sold all that can be sold. What remains is entailed, and half the roof is trying to go the way of the unentailed. The tenants are patient, but winter is patient too. Can the mortgages be redeemed? They can, Dyer said, by a madman, a miracle, or a merchant. Let us attempt the third, Christopher said mildly. I will require the schedules of debt, the names of the mortgagees, the terms, the dates. Bring the everything, I know you have copies. The old man's eyes brightened as if a candle had been set within. I do. Mr. Harrow came after dusk, ashamed and sober. He stood at the door, hat in hand, a giant reduced to careful steps. Sir, he said, awkward, I wronged your father by taking to drink when the sums would not add. But I would right Wyndcliff if a man gave me the chance. I can walk the fields in the dark and tell you where the soil rises and falls by the taste of it on my tongue. Do you know where the hedges are cut and where they are not? Christopher asked. I do. Then come tomorrow at dawn, Christopher said. We will walk them together. A tear slid into the bristle of Harrow's beard. He bowed like a man before an altar. The third reply was a thin rectangle with a crest. He broke the wafer and read, Mr. Alton, if you will see me, I shall receive you in the chapel at Wyndcliff, where the air is kinder to the head than the drawing-room. I ask your courtesy in coming when my lord husband is abroad. Anne. He folded the note and stared at the hearth. Abroad, to the gaming hells of Winchester, to the cockpits and card tables where men who had been boys together laughed while they watched one another drown. Courtesy demanded he go. Compassion insisted. The Countess, the chapel had been his mother's pride. A simple Gothic space, whitewashed and clean, the pews smelling of beeswax and hymn. In the morning light the stone looked like bone. Lady Anne sat in the front pew, wrapped in a plain shawl, no jewels, no artifice. She looked younger than he remembered, and older than she ought to have been. Mr. Alton, she said, rising, I am glad you came. Your ladyship, he answered, bowing with the respect he would have offered a saint. I would come at any hour. She smiled faintly at the formality. You were kind to me when we first met. You spoke as if I were not a stranger who had married into a house at the edge of ruin. I have never forgotten. I said only what was true. You said that Wyndcliff could be mended. She turned, and the morning struck her face in such a way that he saw the map of her endurance. I wished to believe you. But my husband, you need not explain. I must, she said gently. He grows worse. There is talk of selling the timber on the North Hill, of leasing out the glebe and refusing the vicar his lawful portion, of— She stopped. "Forgive me. I have broken my own injunction. I asked you here to thank you for returning. Even if you do nothing, the sight of you has made the servants kinder for a day." He bowed his head. "I will do more than nothing, but I must move quietly. Quiet is a language we speak here," she said, and the words held a depth he did not press. "If there is anything you require," he added, "for yourself." "My requirements are not many," she said, "nor am I the one who starves." Her eyes met his. "But thank you." They stood a moment in a silence not empty but complete. Then she said, "If you are indeed to move quietly, Mr. Alton, there is a boy called Ben behind the West Barns whose father will take his family to Portsmouth by week's end. If there was seed and a pig, they might weather the winter." "There will be seed," he said, "and a pig." She blinked rapidly and turned away, as if the chapel's whitewash had suddenly become of great interest. "Then you are an answer to prayer," she murmured, and to save her the embarrassment of tears, he bowed and took his leave. The first purchases. That afternoon, Christopher sat with Dyer over a battlefield of papers. Names emerged like revenants: Hollis, Bramber, Creech, men who had lent money against parcels of Wyndcliff when the old Earl's hand shook too hard to sign without spilling ink. Sums that had seemed impossible to the parish, 3,000 here, 8,000 there, looked small against the balances quiet in Lombard Street. "We will move through nominees," Christopher said. 3 men, reliable, obscure, will purchase the debts at a discount where we can contrive it and at face where we must. All assignments to be drawn so as to avoid any scent leading to this house." Dyer's mouth worked as if chewing astonishment. "Sir, with respect, this is a work of years." "We have years," Christopher said. "The house has stood centuries. It may stand a little longer, even under a fool. Lord Sebastian will not like rivals at his table." "He will not see them," Christopher said. "We will feed him bread and meat through holes in the wall while he boasts he is dining on roast swan." The lawyer emitted a dry sound that might, in a more elastic throat, have been a laugh. "I begin to remember your mother's smile." They signed nothing that day, not a single deed, for men who have rescued drowning accounts know that the first day must be given over to plan, not action. But before dusk, Christopher walked to the West Barns with a sack over his shoulder, found Ben and his father in a kitchen where the fire had become a memory, and set upon the table seed corn in a grocer's paper, a smaller packet of bean, and a folded note redeemable at Tansley's yard for a piglet come Saturday. "Who are you?" the man breathed. "An old neighbour," Christopher said. "You will pay me when you can, in labour, not coin. Come spring we will dig the lower field and set up a thresh." Ben stared in disbelief, then made a sound like a laugh and a sob quarrelling. He flung his arms around Christopher's waist with a speed that surprised them both. Christopher stood very still while the boy's ribs said too much through his shirt. He returned late to his little brick house, lit the lamp, and stood before its flame until the glass crowded with moths. The day had been long with old ghosts and new work, and he was tired in that agreeable way that means a man has spent himself where it mattered. He poured a measure of gin, not brandy, and set it down untasted. The wind moved around the corners of the house, testing them as it had tested Wyndcliff and found them wanting. He remembered, as if the remembered thing stood in the room, a boy with rain on his face walking away from a manor and deciding in the space of one breath that he would return one day with enough to shame a lie. He had returned, not to shame, to build. "Very well," he said aloud to the quiet room, as a merchant might to a ledger that has balanced at last. "We begin." Outside, the wind paused to listen, then went on, Chapter 4. The Silent Restoration. The work began in whispers. At Carey and Bly, a private room was reserved twice each week. In it, Mr. Dyer spread schedules like maps of an occupied country and moved his spectacles along the borders. Names were lines to be redrawn. Hollis, who held the Millpond mortgage, Bramber with his clause in Rushmead, Creech, who'd taken the South Orchards and demanded double interest for weather. Each creditor fancied himself necessary as rain. Christopher studied them the way a ship's captain reads shoals, measuring depth, speed, and how much coin it would take to pass without striking. "We shall use nominees," he said, tapping the parchment with a forefinger. 3. No more, lest rumour breed. "Mr. Dyer, you trust Captain Vale still?" "A retired naval officer who keeps accounts like a purser and speaks to no one but his dog." "Yes." "Good. He buys the Millpond. I will furnish the funds through Carey and Bly. The assignment to be drawn in such a manner that even God would need a candle to trace it." "And for Rushmead?" "Mrs. Pritchard," Christopher said, and smiled at Dyer's blink. "A widow is easy to underestimate. She will hold land in share for her nephew in trade, a story as old as London." Dyer's dry chuckle was approval. "And Creech?" Christopher's mouth grew thin. "Creech we will pay, but not till we squeeze the last ounce of usury from him in discount." Thus began the silent restoration. Captain Vale, with his limp and his dog, called upon Hollis and returned with a paper smelling of sealing wax and fear. Mrs. Pritchard took tea with Bramber's wife and admired the curtains until a deed appeared beneath the tray like a conjurer's coin. Carey and Bly moved funds in notes that did not say Christopher Alton upon their faces, and Mr. Dyer, beak-set ink upon his fingers like blood, wrote instruments that turned debt into ground. Meanwhile, Mr. Evan Harrow rose at dawn sober and went to bed after dusk exhausted, and in between walked the hedgerows as if each thorn were an old friend. Where ditch had flooded, he cut new channels. Where hedge had failed, he laid it, sleeking hawthorn to living fence with the craft that had lain idle in his fingers for too many winters. He hired men whose names were on Christopher's little slips, paid in full, friend of Wyndcliff, and men hired men till the lanes sounded again with spade and sledge. "Trim the north oaks," Harrow told the woodman, "but leave the cedars." "Why?" they asked. "And no hearth but the sky. Old Mr. Lorry's roof that let in starlight." Christopher wrote each name small in his pocketbook and closed it. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me," she answered with a wryness he admired. "Thank God, who made you contrary to your circumstances." They both smiled then, and for one improvident instant the sunlight through the lancet windows seemed to sanctify not merely stone, but intent. He bowed and left first, for discretion's sake. She lingered, then hid the locket in the hollow of the prayer desk, where even shame wouldn't look. Some men conducted business by daylight, with clerks and witnesses, and some did it in rooms where the shutters were tight and the candles smoked. Mr. Simeon Creech preferred smoke. His office above the saddler's shop smelled of leather, sweat, and paper that had seemed tears. Christopher entered at 9 of the clock in a plain coat and a name he wore for evenings that required one. Mr. Charles Wren, no address, but an air of means that made address irrelevant. Mr. Dyer sat already at the little table, spectacles glinting. Creech's clerk hovered, pen poised as if to stab. "Gentlemen," Creech announced with a triumphant nasality, "I have no cause to sell at less than full value." "The Earl is in arrears and will remain so. The orchard returns handsomely. My men gather part of the fruit for security. Why should I part with such arrangements?" "Because," Christopher said, "I have ready money." He placed upon the table a purse that thudded in a way parchment never could. Because ready money that walks out the door is better than promises that limp in. Because winter is coming, and your debtors multiply in rough weather." Creech's tongue passed over his lips. "A small reduction, very small, might be contemplated for convenience." Christopher named a figure. Christie named another. Dyer said nothing, which was how Christopher knew the figure was still too high. He shrugged, stood and took up the purse. "Good night, then," he said mildly. "We will find other orchards." "Because we are planting 30 years hence," he said, as a man relearning hope. At the farrier's yard, fire leapt and hammered again. At the thatcher's, reeds ticked softly like rain as roofs grew whole. At the mill, the wheel which had not turned since April creaked, shuddered and spun, flinging clear water like laughter. And though no proclamation was posted at the inn, the parish understood. Someone had remembered them. They called him the quiet squire, the friend, the night buyer, names born of gratitude and caution, passing from mouth to mouth by kitchen fire. The only room in Wyndcliff that had not deranged itself with guilt since Christopher's boyhood was the chapel. He met Lady Anne there again, midday, when the staff were busiest and the Earl most certainly not at home. She had brought no maid and wore a shawl as plain as milk. The ends of it trembled in her hands. "I have something of yours," Christopher said, and set upon the pew cushion a small morocco case much scuffed at the edges. Her breath caught. "How?" "It reappeared," he said gently, "at Hollis's office in the market town, among things pledged and things pawned, tagged by a bored clerk who had never seen your crest before. He did not say by your husband. He did not need to." She opened the case. Within lay a miniature, a young woman with open brow and merry eyes, hair dressed simply, pearls at her throat. Lady Anne as she had been the year of her marriage. She covered her mouth. "I have no right to return it," he added, "save that it is yours." "You have every right." She closed the case and pressed it to her heart with a childish gesture that undid him. "Mr. Alton, how much?" "Paid?" He named a sum without weight, and then, quietly, "If you wish to repay, I shall ask it not in coin but in counsel. Tell me, which cottages sit heaviest with sorrow?" She looked up, startled, as if mercy stung. "You would do more?" "Yes. Then I shall be greedy." She told him, the widow near the chalk pit whose cow had died, the Scrivens with 4 children. "Because we are planting 30 years hence," he said, as a man relearning hope. At the farrier's yard, fire leapt and hammered again. At the thatcher's, reeds ticked softly like rain as roofs grew whole. At the mill, the wheel which had not turned since April creaked, shuddered and spun, flinging clear water like laughter. And though no proclamation was posted at the inn, the parish understood. Someone had remembered them. They called him the quiet squire, the friend, the night buyer, names born of gratitude and caution, passing from mouth to mouth by kitchen fire. The only room in Wyndcliff that had not deranged itself with guilt since Christopher's boyhood was the chapel. He met Lady Anne there again, midday when the staff were busiest, and the Earl most certainly not at home. She had brought no maid and wore a shawl as plain as milk. The ends of it trembled in her hands. "I have something of yours," Christopher said, and set upon the pew cushion a small morocco case much scuffed at the edges. Her breath caught. "How?" "It reappeared," he said gently, "at Hollis's office in the market town, among things pledged and things pawned, tagged by a bored clerk who had never seen your crest before. He did not say by your husband. He did not need to." She opened the case. Within lay a miniature, a young woman with open brow and merry eyes, hair dressed simply, pearls at her throat. Lady Anne as she had been the year of her marriage. She covered her mouth. "I have no right to return it," he added, "save that it is yours." "You have every right." She closed the case and pressed it to her heart with a childish gesture that undid him. "Mr. Alton, how much?" Paid? He named a sum without weight, and then, quietly, "If you wish to repay, I shall ask it not in coin but in counsel. Tell me which cottages sit heaviest with sorrow." She looked up, startled, as if mercy stung. "You would do more?" "Yes." "Then I shall be greedy." She told him, the widow near the chalk pit whose cow had died, the Scrivens with 4 children and no hearth but the sky, old Mr. Lorry's roof that let in starlight. Christopher wrote each name small in his pocketbook and closed it. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me," she answered with a wryness he admired. "Thank God who made you contrary to your circumstances." They both smiled then, and for one improvident instant the sunlight through the lancet window seemed to sanctify not merely stone, but intent. He bowed and left first, for discretion's sake. She lingered, then hid the locket in the hollow of the prayer desk where even shame wouldn't look. Some men conducted business by daylight, with clerks and witnesses, and some did it in rooms where the shutters were tight and the candles smoked. Mr. Simeon Creech preferred smoke. His office above the saddler's shop smelled of leather, sweat, and paper that had seen tears. Christopher entered at 9 of the clock in a plain coat and a name he wore for evenings that required one. Mr. Charles Wren. No address, but an air of means that made address irrelevant. Mr. Dyer sat already at the little table, spectacles glinting. Creech's clerk hovered, pen poised, as if to stab. "Gentlemen," Creech announced with a triumphant nasality, "I have no cause to sell at less than full value. The Earl is in arrears, and will remain so. The orchard returns handsomely. My men gather part of the fruit for security. Why should I part with such arrangements?" "Because," Christopher said, "I have ready money." He placed upon the table a purse that thudded in a way parchment never could. Because ready money that walks out the door is better than promises that limp in. Because winter is coming, and your debtors multiply in rough weather. Creech's tongue passed over his lips. A small reduction, very small, might be contemplated for convenience. Christopher named a figure. Creech named another. Dyer said nothing, which was how Christopher knew the figure was still too high. He shrugged, stood, and took up the purse. "Good night, then," he said mildly. "We will find other orchards." "Sit," Creech barked, panic cracking through greed. "Sit, Mr. Wren." "We are civilized men, we negotiate." They did for an hour that smelled of tallow and tobacco and fear, until Creech struck the table with his blotter as if he'd slain a great beast. "Done." Dyer drew the assignment. The clerk sanded and shook. The signet pressed, no crest, merely the hard stamp of legality. When it was finished, Christopher took up the deed and folded it once, twice, as if it were a letter from home, and put it away. "I wish you joy of your bargain," Creech said sourly. "You will," Christopher said, "when you do not see me again." On the street, the night air was bracing and honest. He stood a moment beneath the sign of the saddler and breathed. Somewhere a church clock tolled 10. Farther down the lane, a drunk was singing about Boney and a girl from Deal. Christopher tucked his hands into his sleeves and smiled into the dark. Piece by piece. If Sebastian noticed the fixing of fences, he called it rustic. If he smelled new lime upon old stone, he declared it vulgar. But when he attempted at last to sell the timber upon the North Hill and discovered the cutting rights had been assigned, temporarily for security, to Captain Vale and partner, his laughter broke. "Who the devil is Vale?" he demanded of Dyer, who had perfected the expression of a man asked to identify the sky. "A retired officer, my lord. Steady, known to Carey and Bligh. He paid a fair price to satisfy a prior lien." "A lien on my trees?" "On the land that holds them," Dyer said, the picture of sorrowing pedagogy. "It occurs in families like gout." Sebastian tossed his glass. It struck the hearth, brandy flamed, then died. "This is not accident," he hissed. "Someone stalks me. Buys what I mean to sell, pays off men I would string by their ankles." Dyer blinked, as if sadness had made his eyelids heavy. "Perhaps Providence stalks you." Sebastian struck him then, not quite a blow, not quite not, with the back of his hand. The lawyer took it as if a page had turned in wind. The servants, drawn by noise, found their lord pacing, and the old man dabbing at his lip with a handkerchief and saying, "I will call tomorrow, my lord, with the papers." Sebastian drank till dawn. In the morning he woke with a head like hammered iron, and the conviction that if he could not find the stalker he would at least run faster. He rode to Winchester and lost more than money. He lost a piece of his dignity to men who once had envied it. Word ran ahead. Wyndcliff bleeds. Word ran behind. Someone binds the wound. The field of lamplight harvest, thin though it was, came gold as it could. The repaired mill turned grain that would otherwise have mouldered in barns, and the price of bread in the parish was measured in thanks. One evening, as the sun slid like a sovereign behind the west woods, the villagers set tables end to end beneath the elms by the green, and called it a supper, not a feast, for the year had not earned that word, but a gathering that said, "We are not beaten." Christopher walked down from his little house as if by accident, a man stretched after books. He stood at the edge of the light, anonymous in plain coat and hat, and watched the children run between benches with pieces of pie held like victory banners. Then, pig owner and seed sower judged the apple tart competition with scholarship and no mercy. Mrs. Pritchard poured cider with the proprietary air of a woman who has investments unknown to those who drink. A fiddler tried a reel and then, emboldened by cheers, did better. Old Laurie, roof newly tight, fell asleep with his mouth open and a crust in his hand. A toast was proposed by the vicar to whoever mended the mill wheel and bought back Rushmead and set Henry the Smith to honest work, and echoed with mugs held high. Christopher did not raise his mug, he had none. He tipped his hat, unseen, and turned away before gratitude could recognize him and cause a noise. "Mr. Alton?" The voice came like the memory of a bell. Lady Anne stood in the dark beyond the lamplight, shawl about her shoulders, no jewels, no maid. Her eyes were luminous in the half-dark. "You must allow people to thank you, at least once." "They thank Providence," he said. "Let her have the credit." She smiled. "You and Providence seem on uncommonly good terms." "I make regular deposits," he said lightly, and was startled by her quiet laugh. They stood together, a few paces from the chatter, listening. The smell of apples and wood smoke ran like a thread through the September cool. "Will they be safe?" she asked, low. "When winter bites?" "They will be safer," he answered. "Harrow and I begin drainage in the lower fields next week. I've purchased seed oats through a friend. The miller has agreed to keep his toll fair, and there will be work, copse thinning, ditch cutting, so men may earn where land gives little." She nodded, the gesture small and fierce. "You ask for nothing." He looked at her then, properly, and saw the fatigue that kindness wears when it has been made to walk too far in shoes too thin. "I ask that you keep yourself safe," he said. "There is a line no man should cross. If he crosses, send for me." A pause. "You mean—" "Yes." She drew breath, held it, let it go. "Thank you." Then, because they both knew propriety was a wall one leans on lest it fall, she shifted to safer ground. "The children want to put lanterns in the mill pond. It is necessary," he said. "Let them." When the first paper lantern set upon the water caught its reflection and doubled its courage, the children shrieked with joy, and in that sound something in the heart of Wyndcliff turned, like the mill, slow at first, and then inevitably, It could not go on forever without resistance. By Michaelmas, Sebastian's creditors grew urgent. One, the man with a cavalry moustache and a sense of humour like a knife, Colonel Havisham, began to press. He appeared at the manor not as a petitioner but as a guest, stayed 3 days at cards, and left with a promissory note that made the butler blanch when he glimpsed the figure. "Your brother thinks me ruined," Sebastian told Lady Anne that night, weaving. "But I have friends." "You have creditors," she said, and regretted the courage of it when he turned too sharply. He did not strike her. He had not yet crossed that line, but his breath made a snarling sound that did not belong in human throats. "Mind your tongue." She minded it and wrote, by candle stub, a note of 3 sentences that said nothing and everything, and sent Ben with it into the dark. Christopher found the boy at his door at midnight, hair damp with mist. He read the note, set it to the candle, and watched it burn. "Tell her," he said, steady, "that Mr. Harrow and I will be at the lower gate at dawn. Tell her to walk the south corridor then, to avoid meeting anyone coming back from Winchester." Then nodded, understanding nothing, and understanding all. At dawn the men waited beneath the cedars, tools slung like innocent explanation. The house was quiet in that way houses are when sin has slept. Through the south corridor's windows a pale figure passed. In another hour, a chaise rattled away from the front door bearing 2 gentlemen whose laughter had the brittle sound of men pleasing themselves. "Drainage trench," Harrow said, loud enough for the maid at the scullery door to hear. "A long morning's work." "A long winter's," Christopher answered. They dug till noon and then beyond, and in the digging threw a net of rumour so ordinary that no one thought to look for another net beneath. That same afternoon Dyer concluded a small miracle. The first mortgage, the one taken in the old Earl's worst year, was redeemed, not at full value, not at all, but at what a cunning man calls a price that will keep a villain from asking questions, because he still thinks himself clever. A parchment changed hands in a city miles away. An estate changed by an inch in a village that would feel it like a mile. That night, the wind veered east, bringing frost. In the drawing room, Sebastian poured brandy upon a brandy that had already silenced wiser men and stared into the fire as if it had cheated him at whist. "Someone buys my life from under my feet," he muttered. "Show yourself, thief. Show yourself." No one did. The house settled, floors ticked. In the chapel, a locket lay where a woman's hand had hidden it, glimmering faint as a star. In the mill pond, a paper lantern, forgotten, blinked once and went out. Christopher, at his small table by the window of the brick house, charted figures until the ink dried in the pen. When he slept, late, it was the sleep of a man exhausted by purpose. He dreamed of hedges knitting themselves, of ditches filling then clearing, of a house rebuilt not with stone, but with quiet decisions. When he woke, frost had traced the glass with ferny hands. He breathed upon it and drew a small circle clear. Through it, the hill crouched under the pale sky, hurt, proud, enduring. "Onward," he said to the frost, and to the day. Chapter 5. Revelations and rumours. Rumours walked faster than carts. By the first hard frosts, the parish had learned to listen for them, at the pump, in the bakehouse, against hedges where men rested with billhooks on their knees. A whisper here, a wink there. Rushmead reclaimed, the mill pond cleared, seed oats promised, 3 cottages rethatched before the Michaelmas squalls. And over all, like a gull over a shoal, the name none dared speak aloud, but all understood. Someone. "Providence," the vicar murmured to a farmer with hands like spades. "Mr. Providence has very tidy boots," the farmer returned, not entirely irreverent. Wyndcliff's servants were less devout. They called him the night buyer, and when a latch was mended or coal appeared in the scullery that no one had ordered, they would look toward the lane and lower their voices. The one man who did not lower his voice was the one who had most to lose. Haversham's visit. Colonel Haversham arrived without invitation on a raw November afternoon. Haversham's eyes traversed the hall, noting the threadbare aubusson beneath showy mirrors, the footman whose livery shone with darning. "I honour the weather, my lord." "It blew me in. A glass?" Sebastian snapped at the butler, who fled as if dodging a volley. They went into the drawing-room, where the fire sulked. Cards already littered the table, as if rumour's hand had dealt them. Lady Anne, in the habit of making rooms less cruel by being in them, rose with composed courtesy. "Countess?" Haversham drawled, bowing with a sweep that showed more thigh than manners. "You are as charming as reported." Lady Anne's smile was the prayer-book kind, correct, paired of all temptation. "We are most obliged for your condescension, Colonel. Shall I order tea?" "Tea?" He laughed. "Brandy heats the blood better in these latitudes." His glance slid to Sebastian, and something passed there, an old debt dressed as friendship. The Colonel stayed through dinner, drank through conversation, and at some hour no one later confessed to remembering, proposed cards. The servants, furtive in and out, exchanged looks in stairwell shadows. The Countess, pale as a saint's statue, withdrew on the pretext of a headache and spent 2 hours in the chapel with her shawl about her shoulders and her hands clenched so tightly about the little prayer book that the leather left a print upon her skin. By midnight the Earl had lost more than he had in his pockets to lose. Haversham produced, with the grace of a conjurer, a folded paper. "Merely a security for our sport," he murmured. "A trifle. A signature for friendship's sake." Sebastian, half-drunk, half-cornered, snatched it and scrawled his name. "There. Take your vulture's receipt, Haversham, who enjoyed hunting even more when the quarry leapt at the snares, tucked the paper away, and smiled like a crucifix that had learned to mock. You have a way with ink, my lord." The next day, the Colonel remained, as if rain had pinned him to the earth. He toured the outbuildings, criticised the horses, and prodded the steward on the numbers with a soldier's insolent curiosity. He found time to be courteous to the Countess in the manner of men who believe courtesy must always try the door-handle first. "Your family," he told her in the hall, "has produced lions. One hopes it shall not end with tabbies. I am very fond of tabbies," she said evenly, and passed on. Near dusk, while Haversham napped with his boots on in a chair by the fire, Sebastian rode out in a squall to find someone to admire him. The Countess watched his horse vanish between the cedars and sent a note. A walk that was not a walk. Christopher read her message and did not set it aside. Harrow, who had learned to read a gentleman's silence as he read soil, did not ask a question. "I'll clear the far ditch," he muttered, and was gone like a man who knows discretion can be dug with a spade. At the chapel door, Lady Anne met Christopher as one might meet absolution, relieved to see it, embarrassed to need it. "Colonel Haversham," she began, and stopped, as if the name were a nail she had bitten on. "He brought a paper last night. My husband signed. What sort of paper?" I could not see. Something about assignments and forfeiture. Land? Perhaps not land. She swallowed. The Colonel's manner suggested something worse. "Worse," Christopher repeated, his voice going very quiet. "Like the household plate, or instruments that give a man the right to seize whatever he fancies when a gentleman cannot meet a debt, including—" He did not finish. "Including my jewellery," she said calmly, "which would be trivial. Or the pianoforte, which would be ridiculous. Or the dowry settlement, which—" Now her breath hitched. "Which cannot legally be touched, but legality becomes a thin shawl when a man like the Colonel stands knocking at the door." Christopher considered a long moment. Do you know where he keeps this paper? In his coat. He carries his pocketbook like a heart. Then there is nothing to be done that does not invite scandal. He looked at her, a level look that held no heat and every possible care, except to be quicker. She tilted her head. How does a man outrun a paper he has not read? With another paper, he said simply, drawn by a better lawyer. He instructed her in 10 concise sentences to say nothing to anyone, to occupy the Colonel if opportunity arose, to send Ben, Wyndcliff's Mercury, with a message to Dyer, and to leave, should lightning strike, by the chapel door, with the key turned once and her head high. I do not like leaving my home, she said. You would not be leaving, he answered. You would be leading it out of a trap. She looked at him then with something like wonder, and he had to look away lest he forget the wall they both respected. Go, she said. I shall pray. And then, because plain promises should not be outdone by piety, added, and watch. The first overt clash. The first overt clash. Christopher met Havisham in the corridor by design, as if chance had dressed that morning in his plain dark coat. Colonel, he said, with the courtesy merchants use when they know the price of steel by the sound it makes on a counter. The Colonel's eyebrows rose. Ah, the prodigal in trade. I had heard whispers. Your coat fits too well for a pauper, Mr. Alton. And yours for a gentleman of fortune, Christopher returned, as if complimenting a horse. Havisham enjoyed a man who did not flinch. We shall be friends. We shall be acquainted, Christopher said. They walked together the length of the corridor like men testing a bridge. The Colonel flicked dust from his cuff. I confess myself curious, sir. There's a hand at Wyndcliff that turns debts into paper and paper into smoke. It is a hand that does not smell of brandy. A good hand, Christopher said. Perhaps, Havisham mused, but men who work in the dark displease me. They make honest predators seem theatrical. If I discover who it is, I shall ask him to teach me a trick or two. Predators, Christopher said lightly, seldom learn tricks they cannot use to swallow their own tails. Havisham's eyes narrowed with appreciation. Clever. He glanced at the hook of the Colonel's pocket where the pocketbook bulged. And cautious. You would do well at cards. I leave cards to men with time to waste, Christopher said, then added with bland interest, You slept well last night. The brandy here is generous. Generosity, Havisham said, is simply arithmetic mislaid. They parted with bows that were all edge. Christopher left the house by the service door and did not look back. Dyer's paper. In Mr. Dyer's office, where the dust motes were as disciplined as clerks and the fire small but sufficient, Christopher spoke quickly. The old lawyer listened without blinking, and then rose with a rigidity that made his chair sigh with relief. 2 instruments, Dyer said. First, a notice of equitable assignment lodged with Carey and Bligh and the sheriff's office in the market town, placing all household goods and plate under protective trust against seizure absent writs of the Court of King's Bench. Second, a settlement affirmation, signed by the Countess's trustees, restating her separate property and instructing any sheriff's man that to breathe on it is to invite a suit so slow and expensive even a colonel cannot outmarch it. He took down papers with speed that would have shamed a younger man, sanded, sealed, and folded 1 set for the bank, 1 for the sheriff, and 1, the thin dagger, to be placed where it would prick exactly when required. You cannot prevent a bully from knocking, Dyer said, hands steady as altars, but you can ensure the door is iron. Good, Christopher said. And for the gentleman himself. The old man's eyes brightened with a malice that had learned to read Blackstone. We shall file a demand of particulars to compel disclosure of the instrument he waved last night. If it is valid, it will tell on itself. If it is not, It will wilt under cross-examination like lettuce under sun. They set about their errands. Dyer to the bank and the sheriff, Christopher to the glazier, for the chapel's south window had a crack that would not, and then to Harrow, who needed men for the lower meadow drains. The business of salvation, he reflected, looked very much like ordinary work. The door and the knock. Havisham did not wait. Before noon he stood in the forecourt with hat on head and insolence in stance, tapping his crop against his boot. "I require," he announced to the butler, "the attendance of Lord Wyndcliff to settle a small matter of honour." He did not hand over the paper. He lifted it into the light like a fish he meant to throw back. The butler hesitated. He had seen many fish, but Lady Anne, who understood oceans, stepped forward with the stance of a queen and the voice of a vicar's wife. "Colonel," she said, "the Earl is indisposed. If the matter is civil, it may be conducted with our solicitor. If criminal, I must ask you to address it to the sheriff." Havisham's smile thinned. "Madam, this paper is of no force upon my person or effects," she said gently, "as you must know." She held out a folded document. "This is a copy of my affirmed settlement. Here is also a notice of protective trust upon the household goods. If your business touches either, it ends here." The colonel took the papers as a man takes a nettle, careful, slightly offended that the plant should sting. He read swiftly, his brow furrowing. "Who drew these?" he asked. "Mr. Dyer," she said, "who has known Wyndcliff longer than either of us has been alive." Havisham glanced toward the door of the small parlour, as if bad faith might be fetched like a dog. "Still," he said, recovering smoothness, "there remains a note. A friendly note." "The Earl will answer for his own notes," Lady Anne replied, and anyone listening closely would have heard in it the sound a door makes when it is closed with finality rather than anger. "Not I." The colonel laughed with an admiration edged in steel. "You are formidable, Countess." "I am tired," she said, which was truer and harder. "Good day." He bowed, but left as men do who promise themselves they will return and win the second skirmish by remembering the hedge they tripped over in the first. In the corridor, he met Christopher coming in by the side door with mud on his boots and purpose in his face. They stopped, 2 swords held lightly in the scabbard. "Still acquainted," Havisham said. "Still," Christopher answered. The colonel tapped the papers in his hand. "Your lawyer is a hedgehog." "Our lawyer," Christopher said. "Ah," Havisham breathed, satisfaction coiling. "So you admit to being in this?" "I admit to being alive," Christopher said pleasantly. "It is an admission I recommend." They passed like weather, brother to brother. That evening, Sebastian sent for Christopher. The summons was not phrased as a summons, merely a note, ink splattered, the loop of the S arrogant as ever. Christopher went because turning away would waste time. He found his brother pacing the drawing room, hair disordered, a cut on his knuckle that had bled freely and been forgotten. "Did you do this?" Sebastian flung the colonel's chagrin at him in the form of words. Dyer and his parchment tricks. Anne speaking like a damned lawyer. Havisham turned from the door like a bailiff with a toothache. "Did you do this?" "I advised prudence," Christopher said. "Prudence?" Sebastian laughed. "You mean interference." "I mean that men do not seize what is not theirs," Christopher answered, voice very calm, "and that your wife is not collateral." "You presume to lecture me on my marriage." "No," Christopher said. "I presume to draw a line." For one instant, old affection, a thing buried so deeply it had learned to breathe through clay, almost moved Sebastian's face. Then Brandy breathed for him. "You always wanted to teach," he sneered. "Books, figures, sermons of thrift. Get out of my house." Christopher looked around the room, the gilt chairs, the foxed mirror, the fire that never seemed to warm anything, then back at his brother. "It is not your house alone," he said, "nor will it be if you continue to sign papers by candlelight with men who do not love you." "Do you love me?" Sebastian tossed the words like dice. "I did," Christopher said. "I might yet, if you would let me rescue you without making it a duel." Sebastian flinched as if something had struck him between the eyes. Rage saved him. "Get out," he whispered. Christopher bowed and went, because mercy sometimes looks like retreat. Rumour's reckoning. By week's end, the parish knew that a colonel had been thwarted at the door, that Mr. Dyer had been seen trotting between bank and sheriff on a little mare with ears like questions, and that the Earl had quarrelled with his brother loudly enough to frighten the scullery cat. Rumour added what rumour always adds, a midnight duel. There was none. A broken decanter thrown at a lawyer's head. It had been thrown, but missed. A secret betrothal. Absurd. A hidden treasure in the mill, if sacks of oats be treasure. What was true was quieter. The first mortgage was redeemed. The orchard assignment lay in Dyer's safe. Captain Vale had fenced the North Hill with chain and law. Harrow's drains took water the way a parched throat takes ale, and Lady Anne kept her shawl about her shoulders and slept, 1 hour in 3, knowing that if a knock came in the night, she might answer it with folded papers rather than fear. Christopher, for his part, allowed himself one small thing. He walked alone at dusk along the terrace of Wyndcliff, where once, as a boy, he had measured his stride against the length of the stone balustrade. The wind, which had learned his name when he was young, moved over his hair as if recognizing an old companion who had returned taller. The valley lay in a hush that was not peace exactly, but preparation. "Onward," he told it, and the land, which understands plain words, seemed to listen. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. Frost silvered the hedges so completely that morning seemed to rise out of metal. The parish walked carefully, horses blew plumes, the mill pond wore a skin as thin as pride. Inside Wyndcliff, however, winter sharpened tempers rather than senses. Fires never seemed to bite into the cold. Servants moved as if listening for a summons that would always be too loud. Sebastian woke late, aching and hungry for the one breakfast that never nourished: applause. When his valet told him how Mr. Dyer had ridden past at dawn with a parcel of papers tied in twine, the Earl's mouth tightened the way a rope tightens when it has found what it means to pull. By noon he had sent for his horse. By 2 he was upon the road to Winchester, his coat collar up, his eyes fever bright, his mind fixed upon a green bay's salvation. He did not look back. The house holds its breath. Lady Anne walked the south corridor with a shawl about her shoulders and the quiet of a woman whose choices have been emptied by another's noise. She paused in the chapel and lit a candle, not out of superstition, but to make one island of steadiness in a sea where everything else rolled. The locket, rescued and hidden, lay cool against her skin. "Keep him from ruining himself," she whispered, surprising herself with the petition. "Or if you will not, keep the house from falling with him." In the village, Christopher and Harrow laid the first run of willow hurdles along the new-cut drainage ditches, a simple engineering that made the earth stronger by asking it to bear its water differently. Work warmed them. So did the sight of Ben trotting from cottage to cottage with messages no one would ever read aloud, and every soul would nonetheless understand. Wait. Help is already on the way. By mid-afternoon, a rider came from the Winchester Road with a face like a warning. He dismounted at the smithy where Christopher paid accounts and said into the wind, "My lord is at the King's Arms. Cards since noon. Colonel Havisham and 2 others. It will end ill." Christopher looked at Harrow. Harrow spat into the frost and said, "I'll fetch the mare." "You go." The King's Arms. The King's Arms wore its prosperity like an old soldier wears his scars, polished where it showed, patched where it must. The gaming room lay above the tap, behind a door that had taught many hands to hesitate. Within, heat pressed hard, lamps smoked, The green bays glowed like a meadow that had learned to bear vultures. 4 men sat, Havisham, immaculate, a sour-faced barrister with ink upon his cuffs, a plump squire who had brought laughter and now clutched silence. Sebastian dealt with the extravagant accuracy of the drunk who thinks careful fingers can persuade chance to be kind. "Gentlemen," he announced, as if summoning Parliament, "fate has a taste for me today." "Fate," Havisham murmured, "adores a man who calls her by her Christian name." Christopher stood in the doorway a moment unnoticed, as a surveyor examines a brook before stepping in. He saw the colonel's pocketbook at his elbow, never out of reach, the squire's trembling lip, the barrister's calculation, his brother's ruin circling like a moth at a candle that had already burned itself down to dangerous wick. He moved forward. "Good evening," he said, quiet as an extra card sliding from the deck. Sebastian's head jerked up. Delight, rage, relief. Each tried his features on for a heartbeat, then left contempt to occupy them. Ah, the moralist, come to preach in a public house. "I came to walk you home," Christopher said. Havisham's eyes brightened as a cat's do when a string twitches. "Stay," he purred, "and take a hand. You have the look of a man who knows the price of things." "I know the value," Christopher said, "which is not the same." The barrister snorted. The squire smiled despite himself. Sebastian slammed 2 cards upon the table as if flogging them could make them confess. "Sit," he commanded. "Watch me win back a county." Christopher turned a chair around and leaned upon it, coat unbuttoned, face composed. He watched, not his brother's hand, but his brother's mouth. The muscle in Sebastian's jaw leapt when luck ran against him. His tongue pressed the inside of his cheek when it ran too well. He drank when the colonel did not. "You are marked," Christopher said softly. "Speak up," Havisham suggested, amused. "We like sermons with thunder." "You are marked," Christopher repeated, meeting Sebastian's eyes. "He knows your tells. He has known them for months. He deals patience on your triumphs and pressure on your despair. Christopher shifted his look to the colonel, polite to the point of insolent clarity. "Chooses companions who will look the other way." Havisham smiled with genuine pleasure. "I believe I like you, Mr. Alton. You notice systems." "I notice rot," Christopher said. "You smell of it." A breath of hush moved around the table. The squire swallowed. The barrister's fingers found his pen as if to draft an alibi for future use. Sebastian pushed back his chair so hard it struck the wainscot. "Out," he hissed. "Leave me my sport." "This is not sport, Sebastian." "It is mine," Sebastian said, and rammed the word into the wood like a nail. Havisham spread his hands. "Gentlemen, this is untidy. Let us resume. Stakes as before. Or shall we raise them to satisfy the drama?" "Raise them," Sebastian said, mad light fixed behind his pupils. "Lower them," Christopher said, calm to the point of cruelty. "Or better, quit." "Quit?" Sebastian laughed. "Like you?" "Run to India and return to moralize." Christopher stood. "Come with me, brother." "No." "Then I shall wait," Christopher said, and took up a place in the shadow by the fireplace where smoke could hide whatever his face might otherwise say. The hand that could not be won. Cards pattered, coins clinked, men pretended to forget the hour. The colonel drew a king where a knave would have unseated him, and he did not blink. Sebastian drew an ace and grinned like a dog that has found a bone. The next card cracked that grin as if it had been painted upon a plate. The squire withdrew, gasping apologies. The barrister stayed because arithmetic said he could still afford to, and because vanity told him that witness confers consequence. At last, the colonel laid down his hand with the inevitability of an executioner laying down law. "There," he said, "you owe me X." He named the figure. The room entered a new weather, one in which lamps seemed to burn colder. Sebastian tried to laugh. The sound he made was a rattle shaken at a child. "Paper," he said hoarsely. "I'll draw on Wyndcliff." "On what part?" the colonel asked, all silk. "You have exhausted the orchard. The south meadow stands in pledge to a widow who knows her sums. The timber rights are in the paws of an old salt and his dog. Will you mortgage your boots, my lord?" Christopher stepped forward. "Enough." "Not yet," Havisham said, without looking at him. "The gentleman will write." Sebastian's hand shook. He scrawled upon a slip with the desperation of a man using ink to hold together skin. The colonel let him finish, then shook his head. "No, you grow careless. I require something cleaner." "Cleaner?" Sebastian spat. "Your hands will not pass muster with a washerwoman." "Ah," Havisham said softly, "and yet I am the one who has learned not to drink at noon." He reached for the pocketbook by reflex, and then stopped, suddenly aware of Christopher's gaze, which had fixed upon that gesture as upon a flaw in a beam. "You carry everything there," Christopher observed, voice mild. "Notes, names, traps. What a pity if a candle should set it afire." The colonel grinned. "I never let candles too near my heart." The word held taunt and warning both. Sebastian lunged, perhaps at the pocketbook, perhaps at the man who had just named its power. Chairs scuttered, the table jumped, brandy bled into the green like an ugly wound. Havisham moved as soldiers do, quick and efficient, stepping aside so the Earl's momentum taught him a lesson the colonel did not need to deliver. Sebastian stumbled, overbalanced, and struck his temple on the table's carved corner. He fell to one knee, swore, and surged up again with a wildness that made the squire bleat and the barrister seize the bell. Christopher was between them in 2 strides. He put a hand on Sebastian's chest, flat, brother to brother, firm as a door a storm cannot open. "Enough," he said a 3rd time. For one bare instant, Sebastian saw not a rival, not a sermon, but home, that baffling, infuriating thing a younger brother had once been to him when both of them were boys and rain had made the lanes into rivers for miniature ships. Grief and pride rose together and fought in his throat. "Get out of my son," he whispered, but his weight sagged. Christopher guided him. No one watching could say lead to a chair. Havisham dusted his cuff with 2 fingers, fastidious, bored. "A pity," he said. "We were near a result." He tucked the half-written slip into his pocketbook and patted it. "Another day, my lord. When you are less interfered with." Christopher looked at him over Sebastian's bent head and felt a calm so absolute it was like standing on winter water that would hold because the frost had been deep and would break because frost is still water. "There will be no other day," he said. "We shall see." The colonel bowed as if the scene had been a comedy poorly acted and left the room with the lightness of a man who has never had to lift anything heavier than his own appetite. Aftermath. They took Sebastian to a bedchamber whose curtains were too grand and sheets too cold. The inn's maid brought vinegar and concern. The landlord brought a bill and apology. Christopher sent a boy to Wyndcliff with a brief note for Lady Anne. "He lives. He is hurt. I will bring him home when I may." Then he sat beside the bed and listened to his brother breathe. "You have always despised me," Sebastian said at last, voice thick with sleep and shame. "I despise the man drink makes of you," Christopher answered, because there was no point wasting truth on window dressing. "But I loved the boy you were." "I could love the man still." Sebastian flinched. "You buy the land from under me." "I redeem it from the men who would salt it." Christopher leaned forward. "Let me settle your accounts. Not to humiliate you. To stop this killing." Silence pooled. Outside, carriage wheels hissed on frost like old snakes. Sebastian turned his face to the wall. "Take what you want," he muttered. "You always do." Christopher closed his eyes, only for a moment, and saw, as one sees through lids when the sun is bright, the outline of a future that would not stand still for any man's wish. The road home. By dawn he had a chaise hired, blankets wrapped, accounts squared. Sebastian, grey with the headache only brandy knows how to brew, let himself be led like a man who has made peace with a gallows. At the edge of the old Roman road, the frost still held. Trees wore glass. Breath smoked from the horses like censure. They reached Wyndcliff at noon. Lady Anne met them with her shawl and her composure. She thanked the driver, the footman, the wind, and then she thanked Christopher with a look that said more than the Book of Common Prayer and less than scandal. He bowed, as to a sovereign, and yielded his brother into her care. "Sleep," she told Sebastian, gentle, efficient. "Then broth. Then we shall have no visitors but sunlight." He grunted and obeyed, because the body sometimes remembers sanity before the mind. In the corridor, she turned to Christopher. "Thank you." "Do not thank me," he murmured. "We have only delayed a storm." "Then we shall keep the shutters sound," she said simply. He inclined his head and left by the service stair. There were men to pay, leases to review, a ditch to recut where a bank had slumped in the night. He had always believed work the best prayer. The day obliged him to prove it. A crack in ice. At sunset, the frost softened, and every branch surrendered its lace with a sound like sighing. Sebastian woke hollow, demanded wine, and received instead Mrs. Pritchard's beef tea delivered by a maid who did not flinch. He drank, cursed, slept again. Below stairs, the butler found on the front step a visiting card held under a stone. Colonel Havisham. Upon the back a line, "Tomorrow. Business." The butler carried it as one carries a beetle pinched between finger and thumb and set it upon a salver as far from the Countess's sight as dignity allowed. In the village, rumour cut new channels as swiftly as Thor. The night buyer stood between fist and pocketbook. The Earl struck his head. The Colonel smiled like a cat with a bell around its neck. Truth ran among them, not shouting, but steady, and found its way to Mr. Dyer, who sat very straight and sharpened his pen with care. Christopher walked home along the lane where the hedges bled little drops of melt. He was very tired. At his door he stopped, put his hand against the brick, and let the cool bite of it remind him that matter resists. So did men. So would tomorrow. He made himself a list by firelight. At the top he wrote 2 names, Havisham and Sebastian. He drew a line between them as straight as a plum, and then, very deliberately, a second line beneath, Wyndcliff. "Whatever breaks," he said to the embers, "that line must hold." The coals answered with the quiet assent of things that burn, because they have agreed to be useful. Chapter 7. The night of the brawl. Sleet came in sideways, thin as pins. It rattled upon the chapel's lead and stitched the hedges with glass. By afternoon, the lanes were ribbed with ice. By evening, the green before the King's Arms shone like a mirror laid down by a careless god. In such weather, men either stay by their fires or dare the night to prove them fools. Lord Sebastian chose the latter. Christopher, who had walked the lower fields with Harrow until their boots clanged like kettles, came in early and warmed his hands around tea rather than gin. He had promised himself a quiet ledger, a slice of cheese, and sleep without dreaming. Fate, a poor respecter of private intentions, sent Ben instead, red-eared and breathless on the step. "Please, sir," the boy gasped, "my lord's gone to the Arms again, and Colonel What's-his-name's there afore him, and Tom of Billingsgate says there's sailors and drovers with him as likes a fight." Christopher set down the cup. The tea slopped once and settled. "Find Mr. Dyer and tell him to wait at his office with a lamp lit in the window, then go home." Ben hesitated. "Sir." "Home, Ben," Christopher said gently. "You will not be needed where I go." The boy's mouth set in a stubborn line that looked much like survival and then melted. "Aye," he whispered, and vanished into sleet. The Colonel sets the stage. Colonel Havisham had not come for cards. He had come for theatre. He had brought with him 2 cronies, one a retired captain with fists like hams and wits to match, the other a narrow-shouldered man whose profession could not be guessed, but whose eyes suggested he had observed more debtors' rooms than drawing-rooms. The innkeeper, sniffing coin and trouble in equal measure, had laid a fire in the private parlour and told his ostlers to keep the yard clear. The ostlers nodded and then stayed to watch. Sebastian entered late, riding high on a rage he called brio. His coat was cut for spring, not sleet, his gloves too fine for such weather, his face a mask designed to be admired in lamplight. He tossed his hat to a chair and demanded brandy with the confidence of a sovereign who cannot believe in revolutions. Havisham rose halfway, a gracious spider. "My lord, I feared ice would keep you." "Nothing keeps me," Sebastian announced, and then, because his body remembered falls even when his pride did not, caught the arm of a chair to steady himself. "Cards?" "Not tonight," the Colonel murmured. "Business." The words soured the air. Sebastian forced a smile. Business is a vulgarity one employs by daylight. It becomes urgent by night. Havisham's pocketbook lay upon the table, fat and smug. He tapped it as if it might purr. "You owed me X by noon. Noon has turned to dusk, dusk to dark. Interest, my lord, is a punctual man. He never forgets to call." Sebastian's lip curled. "Draw on Wyndcliff." "On what?" Havisham's voice softened, which made it worse. "Timber? Gone. Orchard? Gone. Meads? Burdened. Your wife's settlement? Iron. The plate? Trust protected. You play a more skillful opponent than me these days." His glance flicked toward the door. "A brother, perhaps." Sebastian's jaw knotted. "He is nothing to you." "He is everything to the question of how long you can pretend the ground beneath your feet is yours," Havisham said, enjoying himself. "But tonight we need not trouble over metaphysics. Coin, paper, ore." He nodded toward the yard where rough voices rose and fell like surf. "Collateral." "Call," Sebastian began, and then understood. "No. Nothing scandalous," the Colonel cooed. "A few pieces of furniture temporarily. The big press in the oak parlour, perhaps. The tall clock. The Dutch landscape with the improbable cattle. A gentleman's debt laid upon a gentleman's things. It cannot be done without writ." "It can be done," Havisham said pleasantly, "if the gentleman consents." "The law likes a signature." Sebastian laughed, a thin sound, like ice underfoot. "And if I do not consent?" Havisham's smile did not change. "Then we shall argue. Loudly. The town likes a story." He leaned back. "Shall we begin?" The yard fills. By the time Christopher reached the inn, the yard had a crowd at its edges, drovers smelling of rain and cattle, 2 sailors on a night ashore, lads who loved the taste of danger because they had tasted little else, sleet-needled faces, lanterns smoked, breath rose from the horses stalled under the lee like steam from laundry. A stable boy had already fallen twice fetching water and was laughing as boys do when pain proves they are still alive. Inside, the private parlour glowed at its windows. Christopher crossed the threshold and stood, hat in hand, still as arithmetic. He took in the details in one sweep, the number of men, the Colonel's posture, the dangerous boredom of the retired captain, the way Sebastian's hand had found and gripped the decanter. "Good evening," he said. Sebastian swung. "You." "Me," Christopher agreed. "I've come to walk you home." "You've come," Havisham said lightly, "to see sense standing up to poetry. We discuss terms." "We do not," Christopher said, still mild. "My brother does not make bargains in back rooms under threat." "Threat?" Havisham raised a brow. "I utter none. I offer the gentleman options." "Men offer options," Christopher answered. "Jackals arrange scenes." His gaze took in the narrow-shouldered man by the fireplace. a familiar face from earlier auctions and dirtier rooms. You brought Mr. Pendry to witness the seizure, should intimidation bear fruit. He writes a pretty hand, Pendry, startled to be seen, looked at his own fingers as if they'd betrayed him. Sebastian flushed. Pride stepped forward to fight on behalf of courage, the latter being absent. You will not speak for me. I shall speak for the household you endanger, Christopher said, for the servants who will watch their master's press dragged through the hall like scandal with hinges, for a countess who deserves peace for one winter. Peace, Havisham mused, is simply the absence of amusement. He rose, smile friendly, eyes cold. Mr. Alton, you forget. I do not need furniture. I need satisfaction. If I cannot have it in coin, perhaps. He glanced toward the window. In spectacle. Sebastian put down the decanter. What do you mean? Only that men in a yard like a quarrel, he said. They do not care overmuch who is right, provided someone bleeds. The retired captain grinned. Pendry licked his lips. Outside, as if on cue, a shout went up. Some small scuffle over a lady's bonnet used as a cudgel. Christopher stepped to the window and drew the curtain aside with 2 fingers. The yard lay slick and treacherous. The horse trough along the stable wall had a crust of ice on it, thick enough to worry a boot heel, thin enough to betray one. He assessed the angles the way he had once assessed sandbanks at the Hooghly mouth, where force would carry a man, where it would dash him. He let the curtain fall. No. Havisham's smile widened. Yes, he said softly. My lord, shall we take the air? Something in Sebastian, torn between humiliation and the old addiction to crowds, snapped. Very well, he said. I will show your rogues how an Alton answers insolence. Brother, Christopher said, this is folly. Everything you have ever done, Sebastian hissed, has been an insult to my right. He strode to the door, kicked it open so hard it clapped the wall, and went down the stairs in the manner of men who have always believed staircases should serve them faster. Havisham followed with the leisurely eagerness of a man who enjoys arriving second and victorious. Pendry slid the pocketbook into his breast with a furtive, lover-like pat. The retired captain cracked his knuckles. Christopher, last, breathed once and went after, because duty does not ask whether it is welcome. The yard, lantern, ice, crowd. Lanterns threw swinging circles upon the ice. Men's shadows lunged and shrank. Sebastian faced Havisham with the theatrical posture of a man who has seen a dozen duels and learned nothing true from any of them. No blades, Havisham announced cheerfully. We are not savages. Words, perhaps, or, he loosened his cravat, hands. Hands, then, Sebastian said, and tossed his gloves to the ground. He was taller by an inch, younger by several years, and weaker by 2 bottles of brandy. The first clash was little more than insult with weight behind it. Havisham stepped aside, bored, and tapped Sebastian's shoulder. The second put them close. Sebastian swung wide and slid a foot. Havisham touched him again, harder. The crowd jeered and then, because men prefer momentum to mercy, cheered. The retired captain laughed. Christopher stood at the edge of the circle and thought, he will fall backward. He will fall upon the trough. The ice will break, or it will not. If it breaks, he will drown in 3 inches of water like a drunkard with a bad grace. If it does not, he moved forward. Sebastian, he said, low. Stop. My lord heard his name and turned his head, not enough to save him, not enough to ruin him. Havisham seized the moment with trained reflex, shoved, not hard, not gently. Sebastian reeled. He struck the end of the trough with his hip, flailed, and went backward. The ice did not break. His skull met the trough's rim with a sound that cancelled the crowd. For a split second, everyone's breath forgot itself. Then the world remembered how to move, badly. Christopher was on his knees in the sleet before anyone else. He lifted his brother's head with a tenderness that had not had practice, and felt at once the human truths a physician would have announced with Latin, the breath shallow and wet, the pulse frantic and fading, the skin already cold. Blood, a line only, shockingly neat, threaded the hair above the ear. "Sebastian," he said. His brother's eyes fluttered. For an instant the man who had mocked him vanished, and the boy who had once dared him to climb the West Oak looked up, frightened. "Chris," he whispered, and in the one syllable begged forgiveness he did not know how to name. "I am here," Christopher said, and pressed his hand over the wound, because one always presses, because the body demands an action, even when action means nothing. "Be still." Havisham stood above them, breathing hard, face shocked into honesty. "I," he began, and then Pendry's whisper laced the air. "Sir, the yard." Men were drawing closer, the way waves break upon the thing that interrupts them. "Back," Christopher said without looking up. "Give him air." No one moved. It is difficult for a crowd to obey an order that does not promise entertainment. The retired captain took a single stumbling step backward, because something in this new scene reminded even him of drill. "Fetch the surgeon," Christopher said to the nearest man. A lad bolted and slipped and ran again. "Chris," Sebastian said once more, surprised by pain, surprised to find himself surprised. Christopher's hand tightened. "Peace," he murmured. The breath tore once more through Sebastian's chest, like a paper screen in a gust, and then failed. The body, once an instrument of pride, pleasure, appetite, and error, became simply heavy. Silence. Even sleet sounded far away. Christopher bowed his head. He did not weep. The time for tears had been years ago when honour went cheaply at Wyndcliff. The time for mourning would come when there were no more tasks. He laid his brother's head down gently upon his folded coat and stood. "Make way," he said. The voice that left his mouth was not a merchant's. It was not a younger brother's. It was something the yard knew without having met before. Men moved. The surgeon arrived, professional panic written all over him. He knelt, examined, shook his head, and delivered the only Latin he had that mattered. Instantaneum. Havisham found words and wanted to justify them. "He fell," he said, to no one and everyone. "He fell." Christopher looked at him levelly. "Yes, it was an accident," the colonel insisted, and in his insistence there was something like real distress, which moved exactly no one. "He lunged. I dash." "Yes," Christopher said again. "You pressed a man already falling." The colonel swallowed. For the first time since meeting him, Christopher saw in Havisham not a predator, but a man who had built himself upon the premise that he was always smarter than Consequence. Consequence, turning up at last with snow in its hair, disappointed him. "Go home, Colonel," Christopher said. "There will be an inquest. You will tell the truth there. If you embroider it, I will unpick it in public and enjoy the work." Havisham lifted his chin. The pocketbook in his breast seemed to weigh more. He bowed, the smallest of bows, like a man at a door he fears may yet be shut in his face, and left the yard with steps that didn't quite balance. The road in sleet. They bore Sebastian home on a door lifted from its hinges, 4 men steady under the weight. Sleet thickened into a fall too heavy for needles and too thin for mercy. Lady Anne met them at the great door, her shawl clutched tight, her face naked of everything but strength. She saw the truth before the surgeon opened his mouth. She did not scream. She did not faint. She laid her hand upon Sebastian's cold cheek and then upon Christopher's sleeve, and said, in a voice so even the house itself held its breath to hear it, "We will take him to the chapel." They did. They set him upon trestles cloaked in linen. The candles were kind. The stone, which had recorded so many prayers without comment, did not change. When the surgeon had gone and the servants had dispersed on quiet errands they invented to spare themselves, she and Christopher stood together at the foot. "I am sorry," he said, and knew how futile a sentence can be when it arrives after everything has already happened. "So am I," she answered. She looked up then, eyes lucid, and asked the practical question that frees the world to move again. "What must be done?" "Mr. Dyer will draw the notices. There will be an inquest. The coroner will find what he must." He hesitated. "I will dine with the tenants' representatives tomorrow. They will need to hear it from a voice they trust." "They trust you," she said simply. "They will trust Wyndcliff," he said, and in the saying of it heard a subtle hinge turn. She heard it too. For a breath both looked at the bier, at the stone, at the candlelight. The wind worried the chapel door once and then gave up. "Go," she said at last. "Sleep if you can. I will sit. You should not be alone." "I am not," she said, and touched the edge of the trestle with 2 fingers as if to steady the sea. "Go." He bowed, more deeply than custom demanded, and left. In the corridor, he paused and pressed his forehead to the cold pane of the lancet window, letting the glass explain certain facts of the universe to his skin. Then he went out into sleet that stung like clarity and walked to Mr. Dyer's door, where the promised lamp burned as if it had been waiting for this exact night. The name changes. The inquest filled the market hall with breath and damp wool. The coroner, an honest man who preferred facts to drama, took statements with patience and a pencil gnawed to a nub. Pendry tried once to embroider. The coroner's eyebrow removed the silk. Havisham said "accident" in a tone that admitted culpable carelessness without uttering the words. The retired captain lied less than anyone expected he could. The verdict came plain as oatmeal. Misadventure. That evening, Mr. Dyer, who had seen births, deaths, marriages, and more bankruptcies than a lifetime should hold, sat at a small desk in a small room and wrote a large sentence in a firm hand. Christopher Edward Alton, 7th Earl of Wyndcliff. He sanded the page, blue, and sealed it. When he handed it across, his eyes shone like a boy's. "My lord," he said, and did not make a production of it. Christopher looked at the words and felt many things at once: grief old and new, fatigue that went to the bone, a temperate, sober relief that the rope might at last be pulled from the estate's throat without stealth. He did not feel triumph. That had burned itself to ash years ago. "My friend," he answered, because titles are not the only courtesies that matter. The house breathes. News moves along hedgerows faster than any post. Before the next frost, tenants were already repairing gates without being asked. The miller lit his lamps early. Children were scolded more gently because their mothers had been frightened and then not, and the current that runs beneath a parish steadied. At Wyndcliff, the great door opened, and the butler, who had been taught by the father and scolded by the son, stood straighter to announce the new lord the first time he entered the drawing-room as master. Christopher paused at the threshold. The room had not altered, foxed mirrors, guilt that tried too hard, the scent of spilled brandy in the boards. Yet the air had changed as surely as if a storm had veered. He crossed to the fire, put his hands upon the mantel, and bowed his head, not to the portraits, not to the notion of power, but to responsibility, which is at once lighter and heavier than pride. Lady Anne came in softly. She wore black, not as fashion but as fact. "My lord," she said, and then, because honesty had become their habit, added, "Christopher." "Anne," he said, the name a kindness they both could bear. "We will make it right." "We already have begun," she answered, and for the first time since sleet began she smiled. Not with gaiety, not with relief, but with a quiet that made the room feel larger and the winter less long.